The morning of June 6, 1944. The USS Harder cut through dark Pacific waters 50 miles northwest of Tawi Tawi, moving at 14 knots on the surface when the lookout's voice crackled through the intercom. Smoke on the horizon, bearing 320, Captain. Commander Samuel David Dealey, Sam to his crew, stood in the conning tower, binoculars already rising to his eyes. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he could make out the distinctive profile emerging from the darkness. Not a freighter, not a tanker, a destroyer, Japanese. And it was turning toward them. Every man aboard Harder knew what that meant. Destroyers existed for one purpose: killing submarines. Their depth charges could crack a pressure hull like an eggshell. Their sonar could track a submerged boat through miles of ocean. Their speed, 35 knots, made them impossible to outrun. Standard doctrine was clear. When a destroyer turned toward you, you ran. You crash-dived, went deep, went quiet, and prayed they didn't find you. Dealey didn't run. He turned Harder's bow directly toward the destroyer and ordered battle stations. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened next would rewrite the tactical manual for submarine warfare in the Pacific. The technique had no official name yet, but submariners would come to call it the down-the-throat shot, a 0-degree bow-angle torpedo attack fired directly at an approaching enemy destroyer. It violated every principle of submarine survival, transformed the hunted into the hunter, and required nerves of absolute steel. Because if your torpedo ran deep or surfaced, or failed to detonate, that destroyer would be on top of you in seconds, and there would be no escape. The Japanese destroyer was the Minatsuki, 2,500 tons of steel, bristling with anti-submarine weapons. Her captain, he had spotted Harder on the surface and immediately turned to attack, increasing speed, his crew racing to battle stations. At 3,000 yards, Minatsuki's forward guns opened fire. Shells splashed into the ocean ahead of Harder, walking toward the submarine with methodical precision. Dealey held his course for another 30 seconds, letting the destroyer close the range, letting his crew see exactly how serious he was about this. Then he gave the order every man had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Take her down. Make your depth 6 to 5 feet. Prepare bow tubes 1, 2, and 3. Pacific swallowed them in seconds. The Pacific swallowed them in seconds. At periscope depth, Dealey could see Minatsuki bearing down like an express train, her bone-white bow wave clearly visible even in the dim light. 1,500 yards, 1,200, 1,000. The range decreased with terrifying speed. At 800 yards, Dealey fired 3 torpedoes. The Mark 14 torpedoes left Harder's tubes with compressed air hisses, their electric motors spinning them toward the target at 46 knots. The geometry was brutally simple. The destroyer was closing at 35 knots. The torpedoes were approaching at 46. Combined closing speed, 81 knots. The time from firing to impact would be measured in seconds, not minutes. Dealey ordered Harder deep. Take her down, all ahead flank. Make your depth 150 feet. The submarine dove like a stone as the first torpedo struck Minatsuki just forward of her bridge. The explosion was massive, catastrophic. The destroyer's magazine detonated in a secondary blast that sent a pressure wave through the water powerful enough to rock Harder even at depth. Through the hull, the crew heard the terrible sounds of a ship dying, the shriek of tearing metal, the roar of escaping steam, the percussion of internal bulkheads collapsing, and then silence. Minatsuki had gone down in flotillation, less than 3 minutes, not damaged, not crippled, obliterated. The destroyer that should have killed Harder had instead become her victim, destroyed by a tactic so audacious that most submarine commanders would never have attempted it. But this was not the first time a down-the-throat shot had been fired. That distinction belonged to another legendary commander, another submarine, and a moment 18 months earlier when the Pacific Submarine War was still being fought with peacetime caution and pre-war doctrine that was getting men killed. To understand why the down-the-throat shot became necessary, you need to understand exactly what American submarine commanders faced in the early months of 1943. The tactical situation was dire. Japanese anti-submarine forces had refined their techniques through years of combat experience in Chinese waters and months of hunting American submarines. Their destroyers were fast, aggressive, and equipped with competent hydrophone operators. Their depth charge doctrine was methodical and effective, and American submarines were dying. The mathematics of a conventional torpedo attack gave every advantage to the defender. A submarine approaching a destroyer from the beam, the standard attack angle taught at New London Submarine School, presented multiple problems. First, the firing solution required complex calculations. The target's speed, course, and distance had to be estimated precisely. The torpedo's running speed and the time to target had to be calculated. Any error in these calculations resulted in a miss, and targets maneuvered, constantly, unpredictably. Destroyers zigzagged specifically to spoil torpedo solutions. Second, beam shots required the submarine to maintain periscope depth long enough to track the target, compute the solution, and fire. Every second at periscope depth was a second the periscope might be spotted. A destroyer lookout with sharp eyes could see a periscope wake from 2 miles away, in calm seas, and once spotted, the submarine's only option was to dive deep and hope the depth charges missed. Third, the geometry limited your options. If you fired from the beam and missed, the destroyer would immediately turn toward your position. You'd given away your location with torpedo wakes, and now an enraged destroyer captain was charging straight at you with revenge and depth charges on his mind. The hunter had become the hunted, and your survival depended entirely on getting deep enough, fast enough, before the first pattern of charges detonated. The results spoke for themselves. Through 1942 and into early 1943, American submarines attempting conventional attacks on Japanese destroyers achieved hit rates below 15%. The destroyers were simply too fast, too maneuverable, and too alert. Most attacks ended with the submarine diving deep to evade counterattack, torpedoes wasted, opportunity lost, crew demoralized. Japanese destroyer captains had learned to exploit this dynamic ruthlessly. When hydrophone operators detected a submarine, the destroyer would charge directly toward the contact at flank speed. The aggressive approach accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It forced the submarine to abandon its attack and go deep. It reduced the time available for the submarine to maneuver or fire, and it positioned the destroyer directly above the submarine's likely location for immediate depth charge attack. The tactical advantage lay entirely with the surface ship. A submerged submarine could make perhaps 9 knots maximum speed, and that only for short bursts before battery exhaustion. A destroyer could sustain 35 knots for hours. The submarine couldn't see except through a periscope that might give away its position. The destroyer had lookouts, radar, and increasingly sophisticated hydrophones. The submarine had perhaps 24 torpedoes. The destroyer had hundreds of depth charges. It was a losing game. And then Dudley Morton changed the rules. January 24, 1943. The harbour at Wewak, New Guinea. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Morton, universally known as Mush, a nickname earned at the Naval Academy for his prominent square jaw, stood in USS Wahoo's conning tower, studying a chart that shouldn't have existed. The submarine had been ordered to reconnoitre Wewak Harbour, a Japanese supply base about which the Navy had precious little intelligence. No proper charts existed, no aerial reconnaissance photos, no detailed information about defences or submarine nets or patrol patterns. Morton's motor machinist, Dalton Keeter, had solved the chart problem with typical American ingenuity. He'd bought a cheap school atlas in Australia, torn out the page showing New Guinea, and expanded the Wewak Harbour area with pencil annotations based on the atlas's crude representation. It wasn't accurate, it wasn't detailed, but it was better than nothing, and Morton had never let perfection become the enemy of action. At 0800 hours, Wahoo approached the harbour entrance submerged. Through the periscope, Morton could see the narrow channel between Kairiru Island and Mushu Island. Beyond, the harbour opened into a sheltered anchorage, perhaps 3 miles across, and sitting at anchor, right there in plain view, was a Japanese destroyer, Harusame class, 1,300 tons, 4 5-inch guns, depth charge racks, everything needed to kill a submarine. Standard doctrine said you didn't enter enemy harbours, too many unknowns, limited manoeuvring room, probable submarine nets, certain shore batteries. The risk-to-reward ratio was unacceptable. Morton had never been particularly interested in standard doctrine. He'd already proven that during his first patrol as Wahoo's commander, when he'd revolutionized submarine tactics by positioning his executive officer Richard O'Kane at the periscope, while Morton stood back to visualize the entire tactical situation. The arrangement gave Morton complete situational awareness, while allowing O'Kane's sharp eyes to spot targets and threats. "We're going in," Morton announced. The decision was final, absolute, and slightly insane. But Wahoo's crew had learned to trust their captain's instincts. They'd seen him sink 3 Japanese freighters on their previous patrol through sheer aggressive action and innovative tactics. If Mush Morton said they were going into a defended enemy harbour to attack a destroyer, then that's what they were going to do. Wahoo glided through the harbour entrance at 3 knots, her electric motors barely whispering. The water was crystalline, clear you could see the bottom at 80 feet, which meant anyone on the surface could potentially see the submarine. Morton brought Wahoo to periscope depth and began stalking Harusame like a predator approaching prey. At 11:30, Morton was ready to fire. Range, 1,200 yards. Angle on the bow, 90 degrees, a perfect beam shot. He fired 3 torpedoes in quick succession from Wahoo's bow tubes. The Mark 14s left their tubes, armed after their safety runs, and headed toward the stationary destroyer. All 3 missed, not because of Morton's calculations, those were perfect, but because 2 of the torpedoes ran deep and passed beneath Harusame's keel without detonating, while the 3rd broached to the surface, its wake clearly visible as it porpoised past the destroyer's stern. The Mark 14 torpedo was proving itself, once again, to be one of the most unreliable weapons ever issued to American forces. Morton had done everything right. The torpedoes had betrayed him. But Morton's attack had accomplished one thing with perfect efficiency. It had alerted every Japanese in Wewak Harbour that an American submarine was present. Harusame's crew exploded into action. The destroyer's engines roared to life. Anchor chains rattled as they were hauled aboard. Within minutes, Harusame was underway, turning, accelerating, heading directly toward Wahoo's position with obvious hostile intent. This was the nightmare scenario every submarine commander feared. A destroyer, alerted and enraged, bearing down on your position in confined waters with nowhere to run. Morton had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether Wahoo survived the next 10 minutes. He could crash, dive, go deep, try to hug the bottom, and pray Harusame's depth charges missed in the shallow water. Or he could do something no American submarine commander had ever successfully attempted in combat. He could fire directly down the destroyer's throat. The geometry was insane. Harusame was coming straight at Wahoo, presenting the narrowest possible target profile. Bow on, the destroyer was perhaps 30 feet wide, a target roughly the width of a 2-lane road. The torpedo had to hit that narrow target while both vessels were moving at high speed toward each other. And if the torpedo missed, if it passed to port or starboard of that narrow bow, Harusame would be on top of Wahoo in seconds, ramming or depth charging or both. "Fire 4, Morton ordered. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if he were ordering coffee. Wahoo's 4th torpedo launched from her number 4 tube. The Mark 14 sprinted toward Harusame at 46 knots. The destroyer charged toward Wahoo at 30 knots. Combined closing speed, 76 knots. Time to impact, approximately 15 seconds. O'Kane had the periscope. He watched the torpedo's wake race toward the destroyer. He watched Harusame's bow cutting through the water, still accelerating, still closing. For a terrible moment, it looked like the torpedo would miss. The destroyer was turning, not evading, just continuing her original turn, and the torpedo track appeared to be passing to starboard. Then Harusame's turn brought her directly into the torpedo's path. The Mark 14 struck the destroyer amidships, slightly to port of her centerline. The explosion was devastating. 540 pounds of torpex detonated against Harusame's thin hull plating, blowing a hole you could drive a truck through. The destroyer's keel broke. Her forward section dropped immediately, nose down, flooding. Her stern lifted high out of the water, screws still spinning uselessly in empty air. Morton didn't wait to admire his work. "Take her deep, all ahead full. Make your depth 150 feet. Wahoo dove like a wounded duck, pushing her electric motors to emergency power, racing to get below the surface before someone on shore started shooting. Behind and above them, Harusame was dying. The destroyer beached herself in the shallow harbour to prevent complete sinking, but she was combat ineffective, her spine broken, her crew abandoning ship. Morton had achieved something extraordinary. He'd become the first American submarine commander to successfully execute a down-the-throat shot against a charging destroyer. The tactic had no name yet. There was no doctrine, no training, no manual instructions. Morton had invented it on the spot, out of desperation and audacity in equal measure. But the story didn't end there. Because Harusame didn't sink, she beached herself and was eventually refloated and repaired. Wahoo wouldn't be credited with the kill. And in the immediate aftermath, nobody recognized what Morton had accomplished. The patrol report noted the unusual attack geometry, but the significance wouldn't become clear until other commanders started facing the same tactical problem and discovering that Morton's desperate gamble might actually be a repeatable technique. The real proof would come 2 months later, when Morton took Wahoo out on her 4th patrol. Between March 19th and April 7th, 1943, Wahoo operated in the Yellow Sea, an area considered too shallow and too dangerous for submarine operations. The average depth was 120 feet barely, enough to evade a determined depth charge attack. Morton didn't care about average depths or operational guidelines. He cared about Japanese shipping lanes, and the Yellow Sea was full of targets. On March 25th, Wahoo encountered a small convoy, 3 freighters escorted by 2 destroyers. The geometry was terrible. The destroyers were positioned perfectly to screen the freighters, and the shallow water limited Wahoo's maneuvering options. A conventional attack would likely result in Wahoo being depth-charged in water so shallow she couldn't escape. Morton attacked anyway, firing at one of the freighters from extreme range. The torpedo hit, and chaos erupted. Both destroyers immediately turned toward Wahoo's position, charging at flank speed. But instead of diving deep and running, Morton maintained periscope depth and maneuvered to line up another shot, not at the destroyers, at the freighters they were supposed to be protecting. He fired 3 more torpedoes, scoring hits on 2 more cargo ships, and then only then did he finally point Wahoo's bow at the approaching destroyers. "Down the throat shot," he told O'Kane calmly. "Fire when ready." O'Kane fired a single torpedo. The charging destroyer never saw it coming. The explosion broke the destroyer's back, and she went down in 4 minutes. The second destroyer broke off the attack immediately, having just watched her sister ship get blown in half by a submarine that should have been running away. Morton had turned a defensive weapon into an offensive hammer, and the tactical implications were revolutionary. But Morton never got to fully exploit his discovery. On October 11th, 1943, Wahoo was sunk while attempting to exit the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait. Japanese aircraft spotted her on the surface and attacked with depth charges and bombs. 80 men died, including Morton, and O'Kane would have been aboard, but he'd rotated off Wahoo after her 5th patrol to take command of his own submarine, USS Tang. The legacy of Morton's tactical innovation, however, was just beginning, because by mid-1943, other submarine commanders were starting to hear stories about Mush Morton taking Wahoo into enemy harbours, stories about him firing directly at charging destroyers, stories that sounded insane but had body counts to prove they worked. And one commander in particular was listening very carefully. His name was Samuel David Dealey, and he commanded a brand new submarine named Harder. Samuel David Dealey was 37 years old when he took command of USS Harder in December 1942. Born in Dallas, Texas, he'd graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930 and spent his early career on surface ships before transitioning to submarines in 1934. He was methodical where Morton was instinctive, calculated where Morton was aggressive, but he shared Morton's fundamental belief that submarines should hunt, not hide. Harder's first 3 patrols were successful but conventional. Dealey sank cargo ships, avoided unnecessary risks, and brought his crew home safely each time. He was building experience, learning his boat, developing trust with his men. But by early 1944, the tactical landscape was changing. American submarines had finally received reliable torpedoes. The Mark 14's depth-running problem and magnetic exploder failures had been corrected through months of bitter complaints from submarine commanders who'd watched perfect shots fail due to Bureau of Ordnance incompetence. With working torpedoes, aggressive commanders could finally execute the tactics they'd been developing, and Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarine forces in the Pacific, was actively promoting aggressive action. Lockwood had read Morton's patrol reports. He'd studied the geometry of the down-the-throat shots, and he'd quietly encouraged his most capable commanders to experiment with unconventional tactics when faced with destroyer attacks. Dealey's 4th patrol, beginning March 29, 1944, took Harder to the waters around Wolay Atoll in the Caroline Islands. The primary mission was lifeguard duty, rescuing downed American pilots during carrier airstrikes. On April 1st, an American pilot ditched near a small enemy-held island just west of Wolay. The pilot, Ensign John Galvin, managed to reach the beach, but was pinned down by Japanese sniper fire. Dealey brought Harder so close to the reef that he grounded the submarine's bow against the coral to hold position. Under covering fire from circling American aircraft, Harder's crew launched a rubber boat and retrieved Galvin under direct fire from Japanese positions barely 200 yards away. It was aggressive, dangerous, and completely characteristic of Dealey's evolving command style. The rescue became legendary throughout the submarine force, proof that Dealey was willing to take risks when the mission demanded it. But the real test of Dealey's tactical evolution came during Harder's 5th patrol, beginning May 26, 1944. The mission was special: reconnoiter Tawi Tawi, the Japanese fleet anchorage in the southern Philippines, and extract an intelligence team stranded on Borneo. To reach the operational area, Harder had to transit the Sibutu Passage, a 30-mile corridor between the Celebes and Sulu Seas. The passage was known to be heavily patrolled by Japanese destroyers hunting American submarines. On June 6th, Harder was approaching the passage when radar picked up multiple contacts. 3 large ships, later identified as tankers, escorted by 2 destroyers, steaming south through the darkness. The night was cloudy, visibility poor, but the moon kept breaking through. Dealey positioned Harder ahead of the convoy, surfaced, preparing to attack the tankers. Then the moon emerged from the clouds, bright and unforgiving. A lookout, aboard the closest destroyer, spotted Harder's silhouette. Within seconds, the destroyer Minatsuki turned toward the submarine and accelerated to attack speed. Dealey could have crash-dived immediately, gone deep, evaded. Instead, he held position on the surface for precious seconds, studying the destroyer's approach, calculating ranges and bearings. Only when Minatsuki was committed to her attack course did Dealey order the dive. Battle stations. Make your depth 6 to 5 feet. Prepare bow tubes. Dealey's voice carried no tension, no fear. He'd made his decision. Down the throat shot. Maximum aggression. The destroyer thought she was hunting a submarine. She was about to discover she'd become the target. At 800 yards, Dealey fired 3 torpedoes. At periscope depth, he watched Minatsuki charging toward him, her bow wave bright in the moonlight. The range closed with terrifying speed. 600 yards, 400. Then the first torpedo struck the destroyer just forward of her bridge, right on her center line. The explosion was massive, far larger than a single torpedo should produce. Dealey realized instantly what had happened. The torpedo had detonated Minatsuki's forward magazine. The destroyer's own ammunition was tearing her apart from the inside. "Take her deep! All ahead flank!" Harder dove as Minatsuki exploded above and behind them. The shock wave from the secondary explosions hammered Harder even at 150 feet, shaking the submarine like a toy. Through the hull, the crew heard the destroyer dying, the shriek of rending metal, the roar of steam, the concussion of internal compartments collapsing. Within 3 minutes, Minatsuki was gone, sunk in deep water with all hands. Dealey surfaced 2 hours later and continued toward the Sibutu Passage. His crew was jubilant. They'd just sunk a destroyer in a head-on engagement, but Dealey was already thinking about the next challenge. The passage would be alerted now. Japanese anti-submarine forces would be looking for him, and he still had to reach Tawi Tawi. 9 minutes after sunrise on June 7th, Harder's lookouts spotted another destroyer. This one was searching, zigzagging, clearly hunting for the submarine that had sunk Minatsuki. The destroyer was Hayanami, 1,900 tons, experienced crew, fully alert. She was actively pinging with sonar, sweeping the ocean for underwater contacts. Standard doctrine said to evade. Go deep, go quiet, let the destroyer pass. Dealey didn't evade. He maneuvered Harder into attack position and waited for Hayanami to come within range. At 1,100 yards, with Hayanami's bow pointed directly at Harder, Dealey fired a 3-torpedo spread. The first torpedo missed to port. The second torpedo struck Hayanami amidships with devastating effect. The destroyer's keel snapped. Her stern rose vertically out of the water, screws still spinning, before she plunged straight down, nose first. Time from impact to disappearance, 90 seconds. The crew barely had time to abandon ship. Most went down with their vessel. 2 destroyers in 2 days, both sunk with down-the-throat shots. The tactic that Morton had pioneered 18 months earlier was proving devastatingly effective in the hands of a commander who'd mastered the geometry and timing. But Dealey wasn't finished. He still had a mission to complete, and the waters around Tawi Tawi were about to become very dangerous for Japanese destroyers. On June 8th, Harder reached the Borneo coast and successfully extracted the stranded intelligence team. The rescue went smoothly, too smoothly, according to Dealey's instincts. Japanese anti-submarine forces would be converging on the area. Time to move toward Tawi Tawi and see what the Imperial Japanese Navy was doing with their fleet anchorage. Early morning, June 9th, Harder was patrolling the approaches to Tawi Tawi, submerged, quiet, listening. Sonar picked up multiple contacts destroyers on the patrol, sweeping the area in coordinated patterns. Dealey maneuvered carefully, studying the patrol routes, looking for opportunities. At 0900 hours, 2 destroyers appeared on converging courses. Dealey calculated their patrol pattern and positioned Harder directly in their path. The lead destroyer was Tanikaze, a veteran ship that had survived the Battle of Midway and multiple subsequent engagements. She was actively searching with sonar, her hydrophone operators listening for any suspicious sound. But Harder was running silent, hovering at periscope depth, waiting with predatory patience. At 900 yards, Dealey fired a 4-torpedo spread. He was learning to compensate for the violent maneuvering destroyers executed when they spotted torpedo wakes. The spread pattern gave him better odds of hitting even if the target turned hard. 3 torpedoes missed as Tanikaze began an emergency turn. The 4th torpedo struck her in the stern, detonating directly beneath her depth charge racks. The secondary explosion was apocalyptic. Tanikaze carried dozens of depth charges, each loaded with hundreds of pounds of high explosive. When the torpedo detonated beneath them, the entire stern of the destroyer vanished in a massive explosion that sent a column of water and debris 500 feet into the air. The shock wave was so powerful that it knocked out half of Harder's electrical systems even at depth. Tanikaze didn't sink. She ceased to exist. One moment there was a destroyer. The next moment there was debris raining down across a quarter-mile of ocean. The second destroyer, witnessing her sister ship literally blown apart, broke off her patrol and fled at maximum speed. The message was clear. These waters were no longer safe for Japanese destroyers. An American submarine was hunting them with ruthless efficiency, but the Japanese weren't going to abandon Tawi Tawi. The anchorage held a significant portion of their remaining fleet, and those ships needed destroyer protection. New patrols were organized. More destroyers were sent to hunt the American submarine. And Dealey was still there, still hunting, with torpedoes remaining and a tactical approach that was proving devastatingly effective. Late afternoon, June 9th, Harder detected 2 more destroyers entering the patrol zone. These were newer ships, Urakaze and another destroyer whose identity was never confirmed. They were sweeping in coordination, using proper anti-submarine tactics, maintaining distance from each other to prevent a single submarine from attacking both simultaneously. Dealey chose Urakaze as his target. He let the destroyers separate slightly, then positioned Harder between them, betting that the second destroyer wouldn't risk depth charging while her sister ship was in the potential blast zone. At 1,200 yards, with Urakaze approaching at an angle, Dealey fired 3 torpedoes. The geometry was more complex this time, not a pure down-the-throat shot, but close enough. The angle on the bow was perhaps 30 degrees, narrow enough that the destroyer presented a minimal target profile. 2 torpedoes missed. The third struck Urakaze on her port side, penetrating into her engineering spaces. The explosion shattered her engine room, venting steam at incredible pressure that scalded everyone below decks. Urakaze lost all power instantly, dead in the water, listing heavily to port. The second destroyer immediately turned toward Harder, intending to depth charge the submarine while she was still near Urakaze. But Dealey had anticipated this. He'd already ordered Harder deep and was moving away at flank speed. By the time the second destroyer reached the attack position, Harder was gone, and Urakaze was sinking. The Japanese had lost 4 destroyers in 4 days to a single American submarine. It was a casualty rate that would force the Japanese to reconsider their entire tactical approach to anti-submarine warfare. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. June 10th, 1944. Dealey should have been leaving the area. He'd accomplished his mission, extracted the intelligence team, reconnoitred Tawi Tawi, and inflicted devastating losses on Japanese anti-submarine forces. But signals intelligence had intercepted Japanese radio traffic indicating major fleet movements. The Japanese were preparing to sortie, possibly to intercept American carrier forces approaching the Marianas. Dealey decided to maintain position and observe. That decision nearly killed him. At 0800 hours, Harder's sonar detected multiple contacts approaching from the north. Not 2 or 3 destroyers, not a small patrol, an entire Japanese fleet force, battleships, cruisers, carriers, and a screen of destroyers. The main body of the Japanese mobile fleet was leaving Tawi Tawi, heading toward what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Dealey was in the worst possible position, submerged in shallow water, with a major enemy fleet bearing down on him and destroyers actively sweeping for submarines. He couldn't surface, he'd be spotted instantly. He couldn't go deep, the water wasn't deep enough. His only option was to remain at periscope depth, present the smallest possible profile, and hope the fleet passed without detecting him. But the fleet wasn't just passing. The lead destroyer was coming straight toward Harder. The range closed rapidly. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. The destroyer was pinging actively with sonar, searching, hunting. At some point in the next minute, her sonar operators would acquire Harder as a solid contact. And when that happened, the entire Japanese fleet would know exactly where the American submarine was located. Dealey made the only decision that gave Harder a chance of survival. He turned the submarine's bow toward the approaching destroyer and prepared to fire. One more, down-the-throat shot. Except this time, if he missed, he wouldn't be dealing with a single destroyer in open ocean. He'd be facing depth charges from multiple destroyers, in shallow water, with nowhere to run, while the rest of the Japanese fleet watched. The range closed to 800 yards. The destroyer was so close that Dealey could see individual sailors on her deck through the periscope. He could see her forward gun turret tracking, searching for a target. He could see the bow wave curling away from her stem as she accelerated to attack speed. "Fire tubes 1, 2, and 3, Dealey ordered quietly. 3 torpedoes left Harder's bow tubes in quick succession. Dealey didn't wait to observe the results. "Take her down! All ahead emergency! Make your depth 200 feet! Harder dove at emergency speed, pushing her systems to maximum, racing to get below the surface before the destroyer's guns could find their mark or the inevitable depth charges began falling. At 200 feet, the crew felt rather than heard the explosion. The torpedo had struck the destroyer, later identified as either Hayashimo or Shiratsuyu. Records remain unclear with catastrophic results. The shockwave hammered Harder so violently that men were knocked off their feet. Light bulbs shattered, gauges cracked. A steam line ruptured in the engine room, but damage control teams had it sealed within seconds. Above them, the destroyer was going down, fast. The torpedo had struck her forward magazine, and the resulting explosion had literally blown the front third of the ship completely off. What remained, the stern section with its still-turning screws, floated briefly before capsizing and sinking. Time from torpedo impact to disappearance, 45 seconds. The rest of the Japanese fleet continued on course, apparently unwilling to stop and conduct an anti-submarine search when they had a crucial strategic mission to accomplish. The destroyers dropped a few patterns of depth charges in Harder's general vicinity, but they were dropping blind, hoping to get lucky rather than executing a coordinated attack. Within an hour, the fleet had passed, and Harder was alone in suddenly empty waters. Dealey brought Harder to the surface that evening and transmitted a contact report to Pearl Harbor. The message was brief and professional, noting the composition of the Japanese fleet, its course, and estimated speed. He included, almost as an afterthought, a mention that Harder had engaged and sunk 5 Japanese destroyers during the patrol. The reaction at submarine headquarters was initially disbelief. 5 destroyers. In one patrol? The previous record was 2. Dealey must have miscounted, or his crew had overestimated their success in the chaos of combat. But as additional intelligence came in Japanese radio intercepts, signals intelligence, reconnaissance reports, the story began to check out. The Japanese were frantically reorganizing their destroyer forces around Tawi Tawi. Radio traffic indicated confusion and significant losses. Multiple destroyers were reported overdue and presumed lost. The evidence suggested that Dealey's claims were accurate, possibly even conservative. When Harder arrived at Fremantle, Australia, on July 3, 1944, Admiral Ralph Christie was waiting at the dock with a special plaque. It depicted a Japanese destroyer broken in half, with the inscription, "To Commander Sam Dealey, Destroyer Killer, in grateful appreciation from his fellow submarine skippers." The 5th patrol of USS Harder had become instant legend throughout the submarine force. Endorsements from senior officers piled up, the most brilliant in a series of 5 outstanding patrols. An epoch-making war patrol. It is recommended that this patrol report be studied by all submarine officers. From Pearl Harbor to New London, submariners were reading Harder's patrol report, studying the geometry of the down-the-throat shots, analyzing the tactics that had turned defensive evasion into aggressive attack. The tactical revolution that Dudley Morton had begun 18 months earlier had reached full maturity. The down-the-throat shot was no longer an experimental technique or desperate gamble. It was proven doctrine, a legitimate tactical option for submarine commanders facing destroyer attacks. Training materials were updated. Prospective commanding officers were taught the geometry, the timing, the nerve required to turn your bow toward a charging destroyer instead of running away. But the technique carried costs that didn't appear in official endorsements or patrol reports. The psychological strain of repeatedly executing down-the-throat shots was immense. You were deliberately placing your submarine in maximum danger, betting everything on torpedo performance and your own calculations. If the torpedo ran deep, or surfaced, or failed to detonate, you had seconds before a destroyer was on top of you. The stress accumulated with each patrol, each engagement, each successful shot that left you wondering if your luck would hold one more time. Dealey's executive officer, Lieutenant Tim Lynch, noticed the changes in his captain after the 5th patrol. Sam was showing unmistakable signs of strain, Lynch later recalled. The aggressive commander who'd once seemed fearless was now quieter, more withdrawn between engagements. He drank more coffee, slept less, spent hours studying charts and calculating attack geometries for scenarios that might never occur. Standard policy by mid-1944 was to rotate submarine commanders after 4 or 5 successful patrols. The burnout rate was too high, the psychological toll too severe. Dealey was offered shore duty, a training command, a chance to rest and recover. He refused. His reasoning was pragmatic but ultimately fatal. 1/3 of Harder's crew was rotating off after the 5th patrol. He didn't want to leave a new commanding officer with such a green crew. He asked Admiral Christie for one more patrol, just one more to give the new crew members combat experience under his leadership before he handed over command. Christie reluctantly agreed. Harder's 6th patrol began on August 5, 1944. The operational area was the west coast of Luzon, hunting Japanese convoys, moving between Manila and the outer islands. For 3 weeks, Harder patrolled successfully, sinking 2 escort ships on August 22nd. On August 23rd, Harder rendezvoused with 2 other submarines, USS Harder and USS Harder, for coordinated Wolfpack operations. Early morning, August 24th, the 3 submarines were lying in wait outside Darsol Bay on Luzon's west coast. Intelligence suggested that a damaged Japanese destroyer was sheltering in the bay and would attempt to make a run for Manila. At 05:54, 2 ships emerged from the bay, the escort vessel CD-22 and patrol boat PB-102, an old captured American destroyer. Harder was closest to the bay entrance. Dealey maneuvered into attack position and fired 3 torpedoes at CD-22. All 3 missed. The escort vessel, alert and competent, had spotted the torpedo wakes and maneuvered to evade. And now she knew exactly where Harder was located. CD-22 charged toward Harder's position and began dropping depth charges. Not the scattered probing patterns that inexperienced crews used, but precise, methodical, attacks that demonstrated professional competence. The first pattern exploded close enough to crack gauges in Harder's control room. Dealey took the submarine deep as the shallow water allowed, but CD-22's hydrophone operators maintained solid sonar contact. The second pattern was closer. Light bulbs shattered throughout the submarine. A valve line ruptured, spraying hydraulic fluid across the maneuvering room. The third pattern was even closer. Cork insulation fell from the overhead and in sheets. Men gripped stanchions, their knuckles white, faces drained of colour. The fourth pattern buckled hull plates in the forward torpedo room. Water began entering through sprung seams not catastrophically, but steadily, adding weight that dragged Harder's bow down. Dealey ordered ballast tanks blown to regain buoyancy, but the hull damage was progressive, worsening with each depth charge detonation. The 5th pattern of depth charges 6 charges in a carefully calculated geometric pattern detonated directly above Harder. The submarine's pressure hull, already compromised by previous damage, catastrophically failed. The ocean entered at pressures that crushed men instantly, that telescoped compartments, that turned a submarine into a tomb in seconds. 79 men died with Harder that morning. Samuel David, the destroyer killer, who'd sunk more Japanese destroyers than any other submarine commander in history, never had a chance to execute one final down-the-throat shot. The tactic that had made him legendary couldn't save him when his torpedoes missed, and a competent enemy captain methodically destroyed his submarine. USS Harder, witnessing the attack from several thousand yards away, heard the final depth charge pattern through their sonar. They heard the sounds of Harder's hull collapsing, and then they heard nothing. Silence. The ocean had claimed another submarine, another crew, another commander who'd pushed aggression to its limits and found where those limits ended. The loss of Harder and Dealey sent shockwaves through the submarine force. He'd been awarded the Medal of Honor for his 5th patrol. The citation specifically mentioned his down-the-throat shots against 5 Japanese destroyers, but the decoration was presented posthumously to his widow by President Harry Truman in November 1945. The submarine that had earned the nickname Hit 'em Harder was gone, taking with her one of the most aggressive and successful commanders of the Pacific War. But Dealey's legacy extended far beyond his own combat record. The down-the-throat shot had become standard doctrine throughout the Pacific submarine force. Other commanders who'd studied Harder's patrol reports were executing the tactic with increasing confidence. Lawson Red Ramage, commanding USS Harder, used down-the-throat shots during a spectacular surface attack on a Japanese convoy in July 1944. His Medal of Honor citation specifically mentioned firing torpedoes directly at charging escort vessels, destroying them before they could depth charge his submarine. Richard O'Kane, who'd been Dudley Morton's executive officer aboard Wahoo and witnessed the first successful down-the-throat shot at Wewak, commanded USS Tang with Morton's aggressive spirit and tactical innovation. Tang sank 33 Japanese ships before being destroyed by one of her own circular-running torpedoes on October 24, 1944. O'Kane survived one of only 9 crew members rescued and was awarded the Medal of Honor. His patrol reports emphasized the effectiveness of down-the-throat shots when facing destroyer attacks. The tactical evolution from defensive evasion to aggressive attack fundamentally altered the dynamic between submarines and destroyers. Japanese destroyer captains who'd once confidently charged toward submarine contacts began to approach more cautiously, aware that the American submarine might fire back instead of diving deep. The psychological advantage had shifted. The submarine was no longer prey hoping to escape the hunter. It was a predator that might be waiting in ambush, bow tubes loaded, ready to destroy any destroyer foolish enough to charge straight at it. The numbers told the story. Between January and June 1943, before the down-the-throat tactic became widely adopted, American submarines achieved approximately a 12% hit rate when engaging Japanese destroyers. Between July 1944 and the end of the war, after aggressive commanders had proven the tactic's effectiveness, that hit rate increased to nearly 40%. The improvement wasn't solely due to better tactics. Working torpedoes helped immensely. But the willingness of submarine commanders to engage destroyers head-on, rather than evading, accounted for a significant portion of the increased success rate. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine struggled to adapt. Their depth-charge tactics remained optimized for submarines that dove deep and evaded. Their destroyer captains were trained to charge aggressively toward submarine contacts, a doctrine that worked well against cautious commanders but proved fatal against aggressive ones. And critically, Japanese intelligence never fully grasped that American submarine commanders had fundamentally changed their approach to destroyer engagements. Captured American submarine officers, interrogated by Japanese intelligence, confirmed that submarines typically evaded destroyer attacks by diving deep and running silent. This intelligence was accurate for the early war period, but by mid-1944, the tactical situation had evolved beyond Japanese intelligence assessments. The submarines weren't evading anymore, they were attacking, and Japanese destroyer captains were dying because their doctrine hadn't caught up with American innovation. The tactical revolution extended beyond just engagement geometry. Submarine commanders learned to use down-the-throat shots as psychological weapons. A single submarine operating in an area known to patrol destroyers could effectively shut down anti-submarine operations by sinking 1 or 2 destroyers with aggressive attacks. The remaining destroyers would become cautious, hesitant, less effective. Fear of the down-the-throat shot made Japanese destroyer captains second-guess their aggressive instincts, creating opportunities for other American submarines to operate with reduced interference. Consider the strategic impact of Dealey's 5th patrol. 5 Japanese destroyers sunk in 4 days around Tawi Tawi. But the real impact wasn't just those 5 ships, it was the message sent to every Japanese destroyer captain in the region. The waters around Tawi Tawi, previously considered defensible with proper destroyer patrols, were now recognized as a death trap. Japanese fleet movements had to be adjusted, convoy routes were altered, resources were diverted to rebuild destroyer strength and develop new anti-submarine tactics. One submarine, one aggressive commander, one proven tactical innovation had created strategic ripples far beyond the immediate combat results. The human cost of developing and perfecting the down-the-throat shot deserves recognition. Dudley Morton, the pioneer who first proved the tactic could work, died when Wahoo was sunk in October 1943. Samuel David Dealey, the master who proved the tactic was reliably effective, died when Harder was sunk in August 1944. Both men were posthumously awarded Navy Crosses for their innovations and aggression. Both became legends within the submarine force, and both paid the ultimate price for pushing tactical boundaries beyond what peacetime doctrine considered acceptable. But their legacy lived on in every submarine commander who faced a charging destroyer and chose to attack rather than evade. It lived on in the training materials that taught prospective commanding officers the geometry and timing of down-the-throat shots. It lived on in the confidence of submarine crews who knew their captain had options beyond diving deep and praying the depth charges missed. The tactical innovation born from desperation and perfected through repeated combat had fundamentally altered the balance of power between submarines and destroyers in the Pacific. By 1945, Japanese destroyer forces had been so depleted that anti-submarine operations became increasingly difficult to sustain. The combination of American submarine aggression, effective torpedoes, and proven tactics like the down-the-throat shot had destroyed the Japanese ability to protect their convoy routes. Merchant shipping losses reached catastrophic levels. Oil tankers couldn't reach Japanese refineries. Troop transports couldn't reinforce island garrisons. The blockade of Japan, achieved primarily through submarine warfare, became one of the decisive factors in ending the Pacific War. The down-the-throat shot was never a guaranteed success. The geometry was difficult, the timing critical, the nerve required immense. Submarines that attempted the tactic and missed faced immediate and potentially fatal consequences. But for commanders with the skill and courage to execute it properly, the down-the-throat shot transformed a defensive emergency into an offensive opportunity. It turned the submarine from hunted into hunter, and it proved that sometimes the most effective defense is an overwhelming offense. The mathematical reality of the tactic was brutally simple. A destroyer charging at 35 knots toward a submarine firing torpedoes at 46 knots created a combined closing speed exceeding 80 knots. At 1,000 yards range, the time from firing to impact was approximately 22 seconds. In those 22 seconds, the submarine commander had to trust his calculations, trust his torpedoes, and trust that the destroyer captain wouldn't successfully evade. If everything worked, if the torpedo ran true, if the solution was accurate, if the destroyer maintained course, the result was a dead destroyer. If anything failed, the submarine would be fighting for survival against depth charges dropped from point-blank range. Every successful down-the-throat shot was a gamble that paid off. Every commander who attempted one was betting his life and his crew's lives on torpedo performance, on his own calculations, on his nerve holding steady, while a destroyer bore down on his position with obvious lethal intent. The stress was cumulative, building with each patrol, each engagement, each successful shot that left you wondering if the next one would be the one where your luck ran out. The legacy of those desperate shots fired in the waters around New Guinea, the Philippines, and throughout the Pacific extends beyond World War II. Modern submarine doctrine still teaches the principle. When faced with an attacking surface ship, one option is to attack back. The weapons have changed, guided torpedoes have replaced straight-running Mark 14s, but the fundamental concept remains valid. The submarine threatened by a surface attacker can choose to become a threat rather than a target. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.